students, and have you observed that your new pair of shoe after using for a period of time becomes wear and tear out, and also our vehicle tires get wear and tear out, and when you rub your hands they produce heat. And do you know the reason for this? In the previous session we have learned it is because of friction. Now in this session we are going to learn whether the friction is advantageous or disadvantageous to us, in what way it is advantageous and in what way it is disadvantage to us. We are going to watch in this particular video, students. Let's watch the video.
Friction. So now we are going to discuss about friction, cause of friction, types of friction, and whether friction is advantageous or disadvantageous to us. Let's watch an animated video to understand more about friction.
How do things move in real life? Say a ball is moving on a flat ground and there's no external force acting on it. Will the ball eventually come to a halt? Yes, it will. Have you ever wondered why? Say you're skating on an ice rink and your friend is skating on the road. Whose movement do you think will be smoother? Definitely yours. When you hold a bottle in your hand, why doesn't it just slip through and fall? Sometimes when you're walking around in a mall, do you remember seeing a caution sign to warn you about the floor being wet? What explains all this? The answer is friction. The reason why the ball eventually comes to a halt is because of the force of friction. The reason why skating on an ice rink is easier because the force of friction is lesser there. The bottle doesn't slip through because the force of friction between your hand and the bottle doesn't allow it to do so. If the floor is wet, the friction offered by it reduces and there are chances that you might slip and fall. So what is this friction we're talking about? It's quite easy to understand its concept. Friction is nothing but a force. It is the force exerted by a surface where an object moves across it. In the first case, when the ball is moving in this direction, the force of friction is acting in the opposite direction. The force of friction offered by the ice rink floor is lesser than the force of friction offered by the road. Hence, skating on the ice rink is easier and seems effortless. The bottle does not slip down because the surface of your hand offers a friction in the upward direction. And in the case of the floor in the mall, the soapy water reduces the friction offered by the floor. In the coming lessons, we'll learn a lot more about friction. We'll see the factors affecting friction. We'll understand if friction helps us in our everyday life or not. And we will also cover the different types of friction.
We learned friction is a force which opposes the motion of an object over a surface. So, as you can see in the examples, when an object is moving on another object, then the friction will be in the opposite direction of applied force. Let us see the factors affecting friction. So, friction depends on mainly two factors. One is the nature of the surface in contact and how hard the surfaces are pressed together. As you can see, the object is moving on the surface or rolling on the surface. In the first case, the object has traveled for a longer distance because of the smooth surface, whereas in the second picture, the object has covered very less distance because of the roughness of the surface or the irregularities between the objects. So friction will be minimum in the case of smooth surface and maximum in the case of rough surface. The other factor which affects friction is the surfaces, how hard they are pressed. In the first picture, the object has heavier mass or weight so that it is pressing harder, but whereas in the second picture, the object's weight is very less and the friction is also very less because it is not pressed harder compared to the previous example. Now let us see the cause of friction. Friction is caused due to interlocking or irregularities between the two surfaces, or we can say the gaps between the surfaces in contact. Smooth surfaces have minute irregularities or microscopic irregularities between the two surfaces in contact, but whereas rough surfaces have larger irregularities between the two surfaces, makes the friction more in the case of rough surfaces compared to that of smooth surfaces. Let us recap this by watching an animated video.
Here's a cube that's placed on the table. We know that if we are pushing the cube in this direction, then the force of friction will act in the opposite direction. If we apply a force along the left, then the force of friction will act towards the right and vice versa. The force of friction will always oppose the applied force. What are the factors that affect the friction? Let me give you 3 situations and then you tell me what it depends on. The first situation is when an object with a smooth surface is moving on a surface which is very smooth. Second, in which the object has a smooth surface and the surface on which it moves is rough. Or the object has a rough surface and the surface on which it moves is smooth. And in the third case, the surface of the object as well as the surface of the table is rough. In which situation do you think will the force of friction be the highest? Intuitively, you will tell me that in the third case, the force of friction will be higher than these 2 cases. And in which situation will the force of friction be the lowest? It'll be the first case as both the surfaces are very smooth. Though there will be friction here, it will be lesser than that in the other 2 cases. If we just look at these 3 situations, we can say that the force of friction increases as we go towards the right. So can you tell me the first factor on which the force of friction depends? Yes, it depends on the nature of the surface on which the object moves and the nature of the surface of the object. Yes, it depends on the smoothness or the roughness of the 2 surfaces which are in contact with each other. If you want to find out if this is true, here's what you can do at home. Create an inclined slope on a table like this and mark a point somewhere on it. Now from this point, let a small cylindrical shaped object move down. You will see that it reaches a particular point and then stops. Next, place sandpaper right under the slope and leave the object from the same point as before. What do you notice? You will see that the distance covered by the object is lesser in the second case. And you probably know why. The surface on which the object rolled was rougher in the second case. And clearly, the force of friction was more. Why is friction caused though? It is caused due to the irregularities on the 2 surfaces in contact. What do I mean by irregularities? Now, even though the table looks smooth, if we zoom into the surface, we will see the surface irregularities. Even the surface of the object has irregularities. Though they are minor, they still exist. Now the irregularities on the surfaces lock into one another. So whenever we have to move an object, we need to overcome the irregularities. But why is the friction higher on rough surfaces? It's because rougher the surfaces, more will be the irregularities. And if the irregularities are more, then more force will be required to overcome them. So the first factor affecting the friction is the nature of surfaces. Is there any other factor you can think of? Let's say there are 2 bricks on a table. One weighs 2 kilograms and the other weighs 5 kilograms. Now I apply equal force on them towards the right. Which brick do you think will go further? Remember that they are both kept on the same surface. And the surfaces of the bricks are also the same. On applying the same amount of force, you will notice that the lighter brick covered more distance than the heavier one. What does this tell us? It tells us that the friction also depends on the force with which the 2 surfaces are pressed together. If the 2 surfaces are pressed harder, the friction will be more. Why is that? Because of the second brick's greater weight, it presses on the table with greater force. Since its surface and the table surface are pressed together harder, the interlocking between the irregularities is more. And this results in more friction. So mainly, there are two things on which the force of friction depends: the nature of both surfaces and the force with which the two surfaces are pressed together.
Let us discuss about types of friction. There are mainly three types of friction. They are static friction, sliding friction, and the rolling friction. You can observe that the static friction is the friction exerted when the object is at rest, and sliding friction is the friction exerted when an object is slides over a surface, and finally the rolling friction is the friction exerted when the object rolls over a surface on another surface. Among these three types of friction, we can say rolling friction is less than sliding and sliding friction is less than static friction. Now let us see friction, how it is advantageous or disadvantageous in our day-to-day life activities. I mean how friction is useful or an evil in our day-to-day life. So we observe in most of our daily life activities, friction plays an important role, like holding a pen or pencil and holding a tumbler in our hand is also because of the friction between the hand and the tumbler. And not only this, while you are writing on a blackboard or when we are driving a vehicle, the friction between the tires and the road provides a better grip. Not only this, even we are able to walk or run because of friction, and the bricks helps in the construction of buildings is also because of friction. Now let us see how friction is evil or undesirable in our day-to-day life. Our new pair of shoe wear and tear out due to friction. Not only this, tires of bicycles and automobiles wear out due to friction, and even knives and razors in our kitchen lose their sharp edges after a period of time. Even though friction is undesirable, there are cases where friction has to be increased, like in the examples of a sportsman's shoe is provided with spikes because to increase friction. Not only this, the tires are provided with grooves to increase friction so that it will have better grip between the road and the tire. And even gymnasts apply some coarse substance to their hands for a better grip. However, there are also situations where friction has to be reduced by using lubricants like powders, oils and grease, and also by using rollers or wheels, and by providing ball bearings in our day-to-day life. While playing a carom board, we sprinkle powder to reduce friction, and wheels are provided to our luggage bags to reduce friction, and ball bearings are used in our ceiling fans and other rotatory machineries to reduce friction. Along with the three types of friction, we have another special type of friction called as fluid friction. Fluid friction is exerted by fluids such as liquids and gases on the moving objects. And fluid friction mainly depends on speed of the object, shape of the object, and nature of the fluid which the object is moving. And the best example for fluid frictions is the birds are provided with streamlined body to reduce friction, and by using that we are also implementing in the shapes of aeroplanes and spacecrafts to reduce friction. And also in the liquids, fishes are provided with streamline. So students, I hope you understood about fluid friction. Let us recap through an animated video.
There's friction between an airplane and the air through which it flies. There is even friction between your skin and the water in the ocean when you go swimming. Friction can be broken down into three specific categories: sliding friction, rolling friction, and fluid friction. Sliding friction occurs when two solid surfaces slide over each other. Sledding illustrates this type of friction perfectly. When you sled down a hill covered in snow, the solid bottom of the sled slides across the solid packed snow. Another example of sliding friction is built into the word itself, a slide. When you go down a slide, the solid of your body moves across the plastic or metal material of the slide. The second type of friction is rolling friction. Rolling friction occurs when an object rolls across a surface. The opening example of a ball dropped on the ground is an example of rolling friction. A bicycle is another great example of rolling friction. Imagine you are cycling down a street. If you stop pedaling and just coast, your bicycle's wheels will eventually roll to a stop. Without more pedaling, the friction of the wheels against the ground will stop the bicycle's motion. The final type of friction is fluid friction. Fluid friction occurs when a solid object moves through a fluid or a gas. Have you ever had to walk home in a storm? The strong winds likely made it difficult for you to move forward. When you are outside in a storm, the fluid friction between you and the air is increased. A swimming pool is another great place to study fluid friction. When you are in a pool, there is constant friction between your body and the water. Because the force of the friction slows you down, you have to paddle constantly. If no friction were present, you could glide all the way across the pool with one stroke. All three types of friction act in the opposite direction of an object's motion. However, each type differs in how the friction is created.
So students, before concluding, we have a question here, that is, what would happen if friction stopped working? Let's watch the video to understand about it better.
Everyone would surely die. We'll come back to that. But first, friction may not seem that important, but without it, our world would nearly come to a halt. We wouldn't be able to write. The lack of friction would keep any ink or graphite from coming off on the page. We wouldn't be able to use matches to start fires. We would barely be able to pick them up at all. Things would get much, much worse from here. We wouldn't be able to walk, but we would also be able to move for very long periods of time over long distances due to the lack of friction slowing us down. We owe our ability to walk almost entirely to the friction between the soles of our shoes and the ground. Without it, we might just look like video game characters experiencing some lag. If we were able to find something to push off of, we could move almost indefinitely until we ran into something. That means you could stand on a highway, push off from your car, and just keep moving as long as you'd like. But good luck stopping. Stopping yourself from moving would likely involve smashing into something really hard. Not only would there be a lack of friction between surfaces, there would also be a lack of air resistance due to the loss of molecular friction. If you pushed off of something with a small acceleration, you would continue accelerating until you hit something. Stopping yourself would be easy compared to stopping other objects like cars. Engines in cars would theoretically work, but brakes wouldn't. So if we wanted to drive anywhere, we would have to plan on getting in an accident every time we wanted to park. None of that matters, however, because you couldn't even drive. Say goodbye to any sort of traction between your tires and the ground. Your car's engine could theoretically still work like we mentioned, and it would likely still turn your car's wheels, but that's about the extent of it. World for any length of time, you would soon starve. Soil wouldn't be able to adhere together with the loss of friction, which means that the entire global agriculture system would practically grind to a halt. Every building held together with screws or nails would soon fall apart as friction is the main force keeping these fasteners in place. Meteors. They wouldn't burn up in the atmosphere due to the lack of molecular friction, so extinction-causing events would be plausible on the daily. Anything that entered the Earth's atmosphere would almost surely hit the Earth's surface at astronomical speeds, a matter of weeks to years. Let's step back for a moment and think about the positives. Our cars wouldn't overheat. We wouldn't get those nasty rope burns. We could take trips across the country or even to the store with just a small push off the wall. That is, if we didn't rapidly smash into something on the way there.
Oh, the pen has slipped from my hands, but I hope you know the reason why the pen has slipped from my hands. Thank you for watching the video.